I call to order the City of Wilsonville Planning Commission meeting of February 12th, 2020. Please do the roll call.
Chair Cameron Mesbah.
Here.
Vice Chair Haberlein.
Here.
Phyllis Millen.
Here.
Jerry Greenfield.
Here.
Simon Springhall. Jennifer Willard.
Here.
Aaron Woods.
Here.
Thank you.
We'll stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America
And to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I see that citizen input is before approval of minutes. Is that how we usually do this? Okay. This is the time that citizens have the opportunity to address the Planning Commission regarding any item that is not already scheduled for a formal public hearing tonight. And we don't have a public hearing tonight. Therefore, if any member of the audience would like to speak about any work session item or any other matter of concern, please raise your hand so that we may hear from you now. And we also ask that you fill the testimony card that somebody has already handed in so that we have a record of who is saying what. I do have a card from Rich Truitt from Habitat for Humanity on the work session coming up, Equitable Housing. Do you want to wait and talk after the presentation of the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan, or do you want to state it now?
Perhaps now, if that works.
That's fine.
Good evening, Chairman Mesbah and commissioners and city staff. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to address the Planning Commission. Excuse me. My name is Rich Truitt. I'm a resident of Wilsonville for 19 years. I'm here this evening on behalf of the North Willamette Valley affiliate of the Habitat for Humanity. And I'd like to begin my brief remarks by thanking the Commission, the task force, City Council, and the city staff for the efforts that you've put into the strategic plan for equitable housing. I've had a chance to look at the draft, and there's some really interesting and exciting prospects in there. I would like to comment just a few things in relation to perhaps a contribution that Habitat for Humanity could make to that effort. As some of you know, Habitat for Humanity does offer assistance to homeowners, primarily first-time homeowners. We provide a hand up through an opportunity to have a low-cost mortgage for affordable housing. And it is indeed a hand up, as the prospective owners have to put in 500 hours of sweat equity, and they take on a long-term mortgage to cover the cost of the house. With that said, it is a great opportunity for folks to get into homes that might otherwise not qualify for home ownership. We also have a program for home preservation to enable folks, typically seniors who own their own home but are facing major repairs or other challenges, to help them stay in their home. So those are two programs that we have that perhaps could play a minor role in the overall city strategy. I also want to mention that we have successfully partnered with other municipalities and developers to identify lots. In some cases, there are lots that don't fit all of the requirements for the developer, but we're able to, in a position to build a home on that lot and make that a usable space. We've done that in several communities in the area. I also want to encourage, as the city goes forward in finalizing the plan, to consider the other kind of measures which are mentioned in the draft plan, things such as waiving system development charges, SDCs, tax abatement, and other ways to try to help assure that there is at least a small stock of affordable housing. Those costs, of course, are add to the cost for any family that would participate in our program, and certainly be a cost they would face in other programs as well. Our Habitat affiliate is in the process of updating our strategic plan. We're in the process of increasing greatly the number of homes that we're in the process of providing. We are on our way to securing control for lots in 2 different municipalities for up to 18 new homes. It's our goal to do the necessary measures to be able to build those homes in those communities, and we hope that we might be able to play at least a minor role in the overall approach to affordable and equitable housing in Wilsonville. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm happy to answer any questions about Habitat programs.
Go ahead.
In your experience, have you found that what I would say is finding lots that are essentially not desirable for one reason or another, or maybe don't meet setback requirements or some other, has that been a more successful strategy in terms of finding locations to build? I'm just kind of curious what your experience has been.
It has been successful, and a couple of examples. We've worked with some developers who have a control over a piece of land, and they have a development, a number of homes in mind. Sometimes when those developments are penciled out, there's a small plot of land that's left, and we've had success in those cases. In some cases, the developers have provided that at a very minimal cost to Habitat. In other cases, they have actually donated the land, and we've of course worked with the cities to make sure that the lot conforms to all the city requirements. But yes, those are 2 examples of how we've been able to do that.
So have you found, though, that has been a little more successful than maybe where assisted SDCs have been waived or lessened? Or I'm just kind of looking for, I mean, you have experience in this, and as we're kind of new at this.
I don't know that I would say that it's more successful. I think each of those measures has a potential for success. And not every development has that piece of land that might lend itself to that. So the overall strategy of reducing SDCs or eliminating them, reducing taxes through abatement programs, those would apply generally to any affordable house that we were involved with.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I don't see anybody else. We will move to the administrative matters. Approval of the minutes of the Planning Commission meeting of February 12th. Any changes?
January 8, actually.
So that's correct. Thank you. Any corrections or changes? I have one on page 4 of 10, under Vice Chair Heberlein, second bullet. There is, on the second sentence, it would be helpful to know the total square footage of the something in the Wilsonville Road Business Park. You remember what it was you wanted to know?
So if I recall, it was looking for the total square footage of the commercial development in the Wilsonville Road Business Park, to understand what that percentage was, and why the Jewett's expansion would be an issue. So we didn't have any numbers behind, here's the total square footage of that development, here's the percentage of commercial, here's the rest of it. to understand where that threshold was.
So you want an all commercial is what you want?
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I had,
So just insert all commercial?
all commercial.
Okay, thank you.
Any other changes? I think I need a motion to approve now.
Yes. we do. I move that we accept these minutes as, with the addition mentioned by.
As revised.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Very good, thank you. We will move on to work session, Equitable Housing Strategic Plan. Ms. Reebold. Or are you going to introduce?
I can introduce it. Thank you, Chair Mesba. Kim Rybold is here this evening on the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan to present an update. As you are aware, we have spent the good part of 2019 working with a team of consultants on this issue. We conducted some additional outreach in the later part of 2019 to kind of supplement what we had heard during the first survey. And then we had the latest task force meeting around the strategies and looking at those draft strategies and some potential measures in order for us to measure moving forward the success of our implementation of the different actions that are in the plan. So you have a draft plan in front of you this evening. Kim is going to provide you with an update on the details of that work, what we heard, and what they have been drafting and putting in that plan. And we'll be asking for some of your feedback that we will then elevate to the council when we go to council in March. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kim.
Thank you, Miranda. Good evening, Chair Mesba and other planning commissioners. I'm going to provide an update, as Miranda mentioned, on where we are in the Wilsonville Equitable Housing Strategic Plan process. With me tonight, I have Lorelei Jutnan. She is one of the lead consultants working on this project with Echo Northwest. And what we'll do is walk through some of the background of where we've been so far in this process to date, just to catch everybody up. But we want to spend most of the time we have here to allow you all to provide us some feedback. We want to focus on the performance measures and indicators, as Miranda mentioned. That's one of the areas within the draft that we know we still have some work to do. We've put some ideas in there, and we spent a good chunk of our last task force meeting trying to generate some other ideas as well. So we'll get to that in a little bit. We also want to highlight some actions, both what we added as a result of the outreach that we did with you back in September, as well as the work we did with the task force, how that kind of got to where it was in the plan itself, and some additional ideas that we generated as a result of the additional outreach that we did this fall. And then lastly, we also want to provide an opportunity to answer any other questions or hear any other feedback you have on the overall plan itself. So with that, just to ground everybody in the definition of equitable housing, it really is going beyond the notion of just looking at affordability when it comes to housing. We're also wanting to make sure that when we think of equitable housing, we're keeping in mind cost, but we're really thinking broader, aiming to ensure that all people have housing choices that provided for diversity of high quality housing, housing that is physically accessible for people of all ages and abilities, housing that is reasonably priced and close to opportunities, services, and amenities. So with that in mind, we set out on this project to develop a strategic plan, really going through a few different steps. First, when we started out, we wanted to do some research and try to see how we're doing now and where our gaps might be. And we presented that information to the group back in the fall. We also spent some time looking at community needs, both through the market research itself, but also in having some stakeholder conversations and outreach. And with that information, we've been doing some work on identifying what potential strategic actions there could be to include in the plan, and think about what might be most applicable and important to include here. The primary goal being that we want to address some things in the near term, but there are also things we can look at in the long term that will help us to achieve more equitable housing in the city of Wilsonville. So just as an overall plan process, we started out with the market research and stakeholder outreach. And so when we were last here, we were kind of in between the stakeholder outreach and policy prioritization piece. We presented you with what we had heard so far from the stakeholder outreach. And that involved some interviews we had done with some housing developers and other industry experts, as well as the results of some focus groups that we had held with nonprofit service providers, nonprofit housing developers, and some local employers and higher education providers. We were also in the midst of having a survey open on Let's Talk Wilsonville, and I'll speak a little more to that later, but we were trying to gather some impressions as to what people perceived about housing costs and the quality of housing and what kind of housing we need more of in the city. And what I'll do with the rest of my time here is talk about how we got from that piece to where we are now, which is a draft equitable housing strategic plan. As Miranda mentioned, we did do some additional outreach in the fall, mostly because we had talked to some people. We started getting some feedback on what some needs were and what some different ideas we could use towards actions to help facilitate equitable housing. We were one of the first projects to use the Let's Talk Wilsonville platform, and we had tried a couple of different approaches, one of which was a standard survey that asked some questions about how people felt about the cost of housing and whether or not they felt stressed about affording monthly housing costs, how they feel about the overall quality of their housing. We asked about what different types of housing they felt like we might need more of here in the city. We also had a stories function open on the webpage, and that's actually still open now, but people have shared some different observations about, why they chose to live in the city of Wilsonville, and also some people shared some struggles and some thoughts they had on why they felt like they can't find housing at a cost that they can afford. So it's really provided us with some interesting background knowledge. But the one thing that we found when we were looking at the survey results is that we had about 76% of respondents were homeowners, and the other 24% were renters. But we know from our work that we're really balanced more 50-50 when it comes to owners versus renters. And so in recognition of that, and in recognition of trying to make sure that we are reaching out to people that are most affected by housing affordability issues, the project received some additional grant funding from Metro. And we were able to put together some more information boards at the library where we had a poll, both translated into Spanish as well as in English, that asked about what types of housing people felt like we needed here in the city or needed more of. And then we also did a targeted paper survey to renters in our subsidized units. And that provided us with some additional feedback to really bolster what some of our needs are in the city going forward. We do, within Appendix B of the draft plan, have a summary of all of these outreach efforts that we did throughout the project. But it was interesting because we had started developing some of the actions to include in the plan, and we talked to you all about some actions. We took those to City Council. But we heard some additional things throughout this process that have added to some of the actions we've looked at in this draft plan. So this picture is of one of the dot voting boards that we had at the library throughout December. And it was interesting because between that and a quick poll that we put on Let's Talk Wilsonville, asking about impressions sort of loosely tied to some of the actions that we put together. We heard some similar themes. I think probably the most prominent one that we got was that there's a really strong interest in single level living. Really kind of getting at the notion that people want to be able to age in place here. You know, we've heard a lot that people enjoy living in Wilsonville and they enjoy the amenities it has to offer. But what works for you when you're in your 30s and you have a young family might not work for you as you get into your 70s or 80s. And so that really got a lot of strong feedback. We did hear a lot too that there's been concern about the lack of affordable starter homes, just in terms of a home that somebody could purchase and get into the housing market. One of the other more prominent responses was that there's acknowledged a desire to keep rents from increasing too rapidly, knowing that that is really, you know, something that affects a good portion of our renter population. The interesting thing too to note about that was that scored really highly, but when we did our research or survey of people living in subsidized affordable units, they actually did not seem to have the same levels of stress over their living situation from a cost perspective. So I think, you know, one takeaway we sort of felt like was that illustrates the difference between being able to get into a unit that is priced at a level that you can afford versus being in a market rate unit that, you know, you might or might not be able to afford, but you're living there because it's a place to live and you can pay for it, so you live there. So it was an interesting observation that we saw. So the other key piece that helps shape the plan that you have before you tonight is the city council discussion we had back in October. So as those of you who are here in September will recall, we went through the exercise with the sticky dots and we had a list of different actions or ideas related to building focused strategies. And we took that and we took the feedback we got from the task force and tried to see where there were some commonalities in actions. And then as a project team, we took a look at those actions and tried to think about where there was a lot of support and there might be a clearer path to implementation versus some ideas that had a lot of interest, but maybe had some questions or, you know, things that might be a little more complex to implement. And so we started to develop this sort of two-piece framework, one of which was classifying some of the actions into tools for near-term implementation, and then other tools that required further exploration. So for instance, one of the topics that came up was parking requirements. And I know we had a little bit of discussion at the last meeting about that. And I mean, there was some, you know, there's a lot of emotions and feelings around that. You know, we do have a lot of people in the development side of things that say waiving parking requirements really can help a project pencil, particularly, or not waiving, but reducing, you know, particularly for affordable projects, that can help out a lot with making a project be able to come to fruition. You know, that being said, parking is a topic that is always near and dear to people's hearts and something that we want to make sure that we're able to adequately address when we evaluate development. So we know that one's going to be a little more complex, but there was, you know, enough support around it that we thought it was worth keeping on the list to pursue. So this was really the starting point for how we developed the plan. And now I'm going to turn it over to Lorelei, who's going to talk a little more about the structure of the strategic plan itself, as well as some additions and refinements that we've made since that October work session with the council.
All right, so I'm mostly going to speak from the actual draft of the document here rather than from slides, which hopefully you all have in front of you. The first thing I want to note is the bright red letter on the cover that says review draft, and say that the point of this discussion and discussion that we had with the task force recently and we'll have with council is to get this to a place where it can be the final document that you all want it to be. So we are expecting to have conversation about this And if you were a careful reader, or even not a very careful reader and just were glancing through it, you probably noticed that there are some call-outs throughout the document where we are identifying the need for additional discussion specifically. So that's a flag. That's where we'll be going in this conversation. The document is structured with some front material at the beginning that provides a lot of the summary, sort of definitional information that Kim has just gone through, describes the role that housing can play in a larger equitable ecosystem and the importance of equitable housing access and affordable housing access for folks in the community. And also sets up the approach that we've taken to this strategy, which really is actions in two buckets, one near term and one longer term. The near term bucket, those are things that through this process, stakeholders, task force members, council felt like it would be possible to take action in the next 2 years. So that's the time frame. The reason for the 2-year time frame is that housing affordability is and equity is a critical need in the community that many people are very urgently feeling. And so identifying those things that are kind of low-hanging fruit, but also are things that can happen within the next couple of years so that the city can begin to take action now was important to stakeholders. That second category of things that require additional exploration are also very important sets of action, but more decision, more analysis, more conversation with stakeholders is needed to really get to a place where the action has enough definition that you can move forward with it. So the front material sets up that framework and says the city recognizes the urgency of this, and as a result is identifying these actions as the things that can move forward in the near term. It then moves into providing some context, including a very high-level summary and overview of the housing needs, which I'm not going to go through right now because I did it the last time I was here in front of you all, and we had a really robust and great discussion about it. Most of the details are contained in an appendix. We've just included a summary because we would like this document to be readable. And as much as I love all those tables and charts, I realize that not everyone else does. So I will just remind you all of the headline, though, the sort of key takeaway finding from that analysis, which was that the city of Wilsonville is obviously going to continue to grow. It's increasing in diversity. The range of housing types that are needed needs to keep pace with the range of diversity of households that are moving into the city. So at a high level, the city is going to need to expand the range of housing that's available and expand the range of affordable price points that are available looking forward. And that's probably going to look like additional attached and detached single-family units, yes, but also townhomes, duplexes, triplexes, quads, as well as multifamily in the future. And we do know that we've got these two major growth areas of the town center and Frog Pond areas, and those are both major opportunities to make sure that you are achieving that wide mix of housing that's really going to be needed to support the future population. Then from there, we jump into the actual actions. Do you mind going to the next slide for me? Thanks. It is a planning document, so we do, of course, have to have some sort of goal-oriented language. We've had a number of discussions about the policy objectives with you in the past. I will just note a couple of modifications. They are in bold on the slide that you're seeing in front of you. The wording of that first slide is a little bit different. It's a little reworded and merged based on some of the feedback that we received from you and from others. And then we've added the seventh policy objective around social equity and inclusion. So other than that, these should look relatively familiar to you. And we've built the actions to respond to these policy objectives. We include in the document a list of potential funding sources. Obviously, it's going to be difficult to move forward with really moving the needle on access to equitable housing without putting some money into the deal. We have grouped those funding sources into those that are locally controlled by the city of Wilsonville and those that your many partners out there bring to the table that the city can be thoughtful about leveraging. Of the locally controlled funding sources, I do want to just highlight the construction excise tax as one that the city could consider going forward. That's a fee on new development when it occurs that can be used only for affordable housing and was authorized through, I think it was 2 legislative sessions ago now that became an option that was available. There's not a commitment necessarily to move forward with that in the way this document is currently structured, but it is something that is a consideration that's out there. And then we move into the implementation actions themselves. And these also should look somewhat familiar to you, but more fleshed out and with some additions, even from what was taken to council last, based on the additional stakeholder engagement that Kim just described. And you'll see if you're looking at page 11 that those actions are broken down into the 2 categories that I described. The implementation actions for near-term action over the next 2 years, and then those that require further exploration. I would like to just very quickly go over each of the actions that are in the 2-year category, just to get us grounded for the discussion. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on purpose so that you can ask questions, and also because I'm sure you all read this in detail before you came in. So we'll start with the transit-oriented development action at the Wilsonville City Transit Center. This one very much came to the top in every discussion because control of land is the major opportunity that you have to really be able to encourage and support development of new housing. And this is a major opportunity to help to ensure that there's a range of housing types that have the kind of equitable access to transit and services and visitability that you might want to see on to achieve an equitable housing goal. The kinds of things that need to happen to get prepared to do that include what we're calling a development opportunity study. That's a common term that essentially means get to really understand and clarify what the city's goals for the site is, so that when you engage a developer, those are already clearly articulated and there are no surprises in the mix, and to really understand what the market conditions are for development at the site. And then from there to move into outreach to developers. One way that you can do that is through developing a site prospectus, which is essentially a little summary of the opportunity, and then to move into a solicitation process to attract a developer who is willing to engage with the city on the kind of equitable housing development implementation you'd like to see. The next one, 1B, is to be very thoughtful and proactive about incorporating equitable housing needs into the middle housing planning that the legislature has required you to do through House Bill 2001. The idea here is to go beyond those requirements to think about code changes that would encourage accessibility, design options, and promote affordability. And there are a number of questions around this that I think would need to be answered before you could get into it in more detail, including understanding what the current ongoing rulemaking for House Bill 2001 is going to tell you need to do. The next one is to define equitable housing approaches in your new or urban growth areas, and that's looking at Frog Pond East and South, and this is one that we would like to talk with you about more later in the evening. And here what we are suggesting is to develop some clarity around policy guidance for master planning before master planning begins, around potential targets for accessibility as well as affordability, so that we can make sure that development in those areas is meeting your goals. And the next one is 1D, that's the tax abatements. There's many flavors of tax abatements, some of them which work better for Wilsonville than others. They all require a sort of common set of questions to be explored around the amount of revenue that the city might be willing to forego, and how you can develop a program that will ensure that the tax abatement is targeting the kind of development that you like to see. But as you heard even in the public comment before this presentation, tax abatements can really help to move the needle for developers who want to create housing and affordable housing. And last but not least is 1E, which is recognizing that staff support to pay attention to and foster the ongoing implementation of this plan, to develop the kinds of relationships with partners and to can make sure that those are ripe, to pay attention to all of the partner funding sources and make sure that the city is leveraging those, and to be a resource and information provider to the community is a really important part of moving forward on this plan. So that'll give you a quick flavor of all of the do now actions over the course of the next couple of years. And I'm going to skip over the tools requiring further exploration, though of course you can ask questions about them when we get to that. The final section of the plan goes through some steps for implementation that are broadly about the plan itself, recognizing that there needs to be some staff work programs and some budgeting. There needs to be ongoing community conversations. And this is where the performance measure piece comes in that we'd like to be sure to talk about tonight. It is important to be paying attention to indicators of success and making sure that you're being thoughtful about the next set of steps that you might take after this first 2-year period will require you having ongoing access to data and information. So we'd like to talk to you more about what measures belong there. So there's a very high-level flyover of the content in the plan.
Thank you. Before we get into the discussion, we did note that there was a task force meeting back on the last week of January, so pretty recent. But it was a really good first step in trying to get some feedback to help facilitate both our discussion tonight as well as our discussion that we will have with City Council at the work session we have upcoming on March 2nd. So we did 2 primary activities at that meeting. One of these was having a small group discussion about some of the additional actions that were added to the plan and asking some questions and getting some input. These really centered around the ideas of increasing home ownership, reducing displacement risk, and promoting aging in place. So we got some good feedback, some ideas. One of the things that we noted was that while we created these actions at a really high level based upon a lot of the additional outreach we had done, that there was a lot of intersectionality between some of these ideas because, reducing or promoting aging in place and reducing displacement risk, there's a lot of common ideas in those areas. One of the examples we heard a lot from both groups that actually discussed this was the notion of home repair programs and how that really can help particularly older residents be able to stay in their home. And so it's reducing displacement, it's helping aging in place. ADUs were another one that were a pretty big topic of conversation because it is something, that helps. If you have different generations on a lot, you can promote aging in place that way. Potentially, if there are smaller units available, they help facilitate home ownership as well. And so these were really interesting ideas, and we'll touch on some of those additional actions as a part of our discussion. But the other key piece was a brainstorm of performance measures, and what we did was just an activity where we took all of those policy objectives that we just had on the screen, and we had boards of paper, and we just had people write down different ideas for what they thought we could use to measure how we're succeeding or, maybe not succeeding at trying to reach those policy objectives. And so your packet tonight included a handout that had a quick summary of some of the notes from those activities. And so as we go through the question prompts that we have for you tonight, I would encourage you to refer to those as well, particularly for the performance measures. So with that, I mentioned the next steps. We will be going to City Council for our work session on March 2nd, and we will present the draft plan to them at that point. And our goal is to take some of these ideas for performance measures and refine them a little more, take a look at what actually is feasible or see what might have the best potential at measuring success, and present those to them to get some direction as to what should go in that part of the plan. Then in April, our plan is to come back to you all for a public hearing on a final equitable housing strategic plan. And so at that point, our hope is to fill in the gaps that we have right now and take some of the input that we've received, not only from the task force, but from you tonight, as well as the City Council in March, and get that into a final document. And we would then move forward for another public hearing in May before the City Council to get their recommendation on approving the document. So with that, if there's any questions on what we presented, I think we could entertain a couple, and then I'll turn it over to Lorelei to get into some questions we have for you.
Questions? Comments? You do? Okay.
Chair Greenfield, could you grab your mic for me, please?
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
Where is it? I'm not sure I've mentioned this before, although it has certainly occurred to me multiple times, that we tend to equate equitable, the concept of equitable, with affordable. And I think that is only partly true. That is to say, the association is only partly true. But I'm reminded of the mantra of the civil rights movement back in the 1960s, back in my day, where there was talk of separate but equal. And it was pretty well considered that separate is not equal. And so what I don't see enough of in our thinking here, although it's not totally absent, is the notion of distribution of housing types and affordability. There is an interesting study. Do you know the chapter and verse on Raj Chetty's piece?
Not the chapter and verse.
I intended to bring it. There is a very current and very important, you know it.
I do.
Yes.
Probably not chapter and verse. but
Okay. A study.
Chapter maybe, verse no.
Okay, a study by Dr. Raj Chetty of the effect of housing neighborhood in the sense of neighbors, and proximity to neighbors in the early development, especially early development of children. And it is a very important concept and a very important practice that if you're looking to improve the well-being and the performance of children, particularly looking at school performance, but then later on in life as well, who they grew up with has a tremendous effect on the later performance, on the development, the course of development, and the later performance. Obviously, any plan that does not take account of that effect becomes subject to the possibility of, I hate to use I won't use the word because it really doesn't apply to Wilsonville at all, but the concentration of similar demographics does not permit the kind of vertical as well as lateral contacts that are important for a child's development and success later in life. So I like the notion of social equity and inclusion, but I don't want to lose the inclusion part of it when we're talking about social equity. I think, and it's very problematic how you, in an established community with an established housing stock, how you distribute different income levels and different qualities of different types of construction so that you achieve this kind of inclusion, which is important. It's very difficult. When I was young, in one of my earlier incarnations, I was a family services caseworker for Multnomah County. And at that time, we're talking back in the 60s, At that time, Multnomah County had a strategy of buying up properties that were available throughout the city and preparing them, renovating as necessary for family subsidies. So that my caseload was distributed. I had my beat was between, what was it, Division and Foster, out to what is now 205. And I had families in ordinary blocks who were living in the same kind of houses as their neighbors who were not on public assistance. And it seemed to me then, and it seems to me even more now because I have a better understanding of the dynamics, that this was an ideal kind of thing. I don't know whether Multnomah County is able to do this anymore, but it is the exact opposite of what I was thrust into when I moved to the East Coast and was faced with a different kind of social problem of housing projects, which were the exact opposite of what Chetty's talking about. Now, I don't think Wilsonville is in danger of having housing projects like that, but I do think that there's a need for us to be conscious of the need to distribute the subsidies, however we are providing for diversity in our housing, to distribute those to the extent that it's possible in an established town with an existing housing stock. I just want to raise that as a consciousness issue, and I don't think that it's really reflected in the report. I kind of wish it were, but we still should be thinking about it.
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that up. I was going to bring up the broader umbrella under which the student performance is only one issue, and that's social resilience or urban resilience, which requires inclusion. And I'm very happy that inclusion has been included in this strategic plan. Most people don't think about the need for that resilience. Resilience is the ability to adapt when change happens. And we can easily think that if a population getting older, having a mixture in that population that has younger people provides resilience, because if an old neighbor can't do something, the younger neighbor can do it for them or help them or whatever. The same applies to various income levels. The same applies to various cultural kinds of backgrounds. These all provide ability to solve problems in a variety of ways when change happens and our go-to solutions don't work anymore. Somebody may say, in my village, we did it this way, and it may work here. That's all it takes. So in a lot of the literature, especially recently, I'm sure the planners are well aware, this issue of resilience is being brought up, especially because we are dealing with all kinds of sped up changes that populations are going to have to deal with. So the student performance is just one of them. A student in an upper class upbringing is being brought up with expectations that a student in a distressed family may not have. And just being in the same class, this creates a sharing of vision that has been proven to create different outcomes, different ways of solving problems for the underprivileged children. The same thing applies to in all manner of different things in the strata that we're dealing with. So I was looking for, in the benefits of having an equitable housing plan, some statement about urban resilience and the ability of Wilsonville to weather crises and sudden changes and unpredictability better, because it has a better mix. Although, we are dealing with a two-year, let's see what we can do in actions. And these lofty long-term goals aren't two-year goals.
Right.
But I think it is important for us in whatever we do to make sure we don't take steps that paint us in a corner, that then later on we have to solve problems to become more inclusive because we kind of created these pockets and exclusiveness. So that was one of I appreciate you bringing it up. I had another question, and that is, I know that you had a trends. The only trends that we had for Wilsonville population was with Latinx population. We don't have anything with age or with income. Are we getting younger? Are we getting older as a population? Are we getting wealthier? Are we getting poorer?
There's a fair amount of information about that included in the appendix on the market assessment.
Okay.
And Wilsonville is generally younger than its surrounding cities.
I saw that within the county. But the trends with the city, not projecting, in the last 20 years, is it getting younger? I know it's growing. But is it growing with younger population, or is it just staying the same, or what?
We've shown both. So we have a fairly large portion of senior population that is aging here in Wilsonville and expected to stay. And then we also have a large portion of millennial growth. So there's been a lot of growth in the millennials in Wilsonville, and that's expected to continue.
So is the average age going down?
Yes.
Thank you. That is helpful.
And it's consistent with national demographics, but a little, if it's a barbell with heavier weighting on the older and the younger side, your younger side is a little heavier than other communities. Tip
Yes.
over if you lift it.
And regarding income, now that is housing cost is a variable. I mean, that is variable of housing cost. Maybe because we're not as affordable, your income is going up because that's who can afford it here. But do we have any data on that in the past 10, 20 years? Are we becoming better off, staying the same?
Would you like me to start?
Go for it.
So the work that we've done in particular with like the housing report and reporting on it each year, the average income in Wilsonville is going up, and we typically tend to be slightly higher than the county average area median income. But there's also been a significant increase in housing costs. So in terms of, I guess, whether households are actually increasing in wealth or in proportionate, I don't know that we can say that, but we do know that the median income for Wilsonville has gone up over the last 10 to 20 years.
And do we know?
But costs have also gone up. So that, I guess that's the part where it's very difficult for me to answer in terms of whether.
Understood.
Yeah, and I'll just add that there is a significant issue with cost burdening in Wilsonville, and that especially for people who are below 80% of median family income, nearly all of them are cost burdened or severely cost burdened as a result of housing. They're spending 30 or 50%, more than 30 or 50% of their income on housing.
See, I'm trying to see if we have enough data to be able to say that the last 10, 15 years, we are gentrifying or not. But that may be a variable that is caused by employment data as well. If we have more upper level software and this kind of thing, jobs in Wilsonville, that would indicate, that would be an element of why you're seeing increased income, because that's where the new jobs are in the city. Now, all of these are very difficult to pin down, I understand, because people come in to work here, living outside, or live here and work outside, and all of that. But some of these trends I was hoping to see, to give me a little bit of a feeling of whether or not displacement has already been a problem, because we are moving towards more higher income and able to pay. Therefore, the market is going in that direction, so that it tells us what we're fighting against in creating this, the wide range of available housing.
I think what I'm hearing you say is that we should bring forward more information about demographic trends and projections, and that maybe the summary was a little too light for your taste and
Well,
didn't tell enough of the story of the kind of need that the city is facing.
I was mostly thinking that the whole, I'm not looking to have overkill with data and stuff. The issue I was trying to prepare for, especially when the public hearing and other things, because we are dealing with citizen and resident sentiments here, is the issue will come up that we are already having more of this type of housing that you're trying to create, and we should do more single housing, $1 million houses, okay? I want to know if that is the case. We need to have evidence and data that says, no, here's the data, you know, this is the demand, this is what we have. $1 million houses are inadequate supply. That's what we found in the Madison area when we did our housing analysis. It wasn't just a market, it was a step deeper than what we're doing here, because we had already done this and we were taking a deeper dive. But it found out that we had plenty of single family, of different choices available. It was the other stuff we didn't have, the middle housing we didn't have available for the market, for the demand. I'm trying to see if we have anything that gets us anywhere close to being able to provide that kind of an evidence. For the residents who rightly are saying, is this a real problem, or are we just, you know, trying to be overactive about something that will take care of itself? As a planner, I want to be able to say, no, let's look at it.
And I believe we have in the market report, it's more snapshot in time data of the different income tiers and where there are deficiencies in the housing costs versus where, so there's certain ranges, there's a surplus, and in other ranges, there's a deficit. But I don't know that, I think we'll have to look to see in terms of a time shift, because that's what we don't, I believe, have in the market report. But we might be able to pull some.
Snapshot is helpful.
Yeah, but I think you're looking for trends, like is that changing or not? Yes. So we can see what info we might be able to.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly it's a regional, the trends are driven by regional market changes that are all pointing in the direction of increasing challenges with housing affordability and housing availability and access to housing that is well located. So I think we can do more to tell that story. In the body of the report, I think you're right that it would be helpful to have a bullet point summary of some of that analysis pulled forward into the body.
And to be fair with you, we were dealing with a region-wide study in Madison area. This is citywide. Now, in that case, we had this issue of cities saying, well, you know, region-wide, we have this amount of upmarket housing that is necessary. We want that. Everybody else can have all the other stuff. Well, then the issue was, it's not fair. So everybody needs to have a share of all of this stuff. But I understand that we are dealing with a small piece of the larger metro area here, and it's more difficult to come up with that. Did you raise your hand? Commissioner Woods?
Very comprehensive. You know,
Thank you.
Planning commissioner, I went through it very thoroughly. My question is around the portion that you have on the growth for people of color, Blacks, Latinos, others. And my question is, what is going to encourage, or what do you guys perceive will encourage people of color to move into Wilsonville? Because I didn't see anything that said, well, you know, jobs, we anticipate jobs that people of color could fulfill, and not so much from the professional level, but otherwise. You know, as a 24-year resident here, I've not seen the growth, hardly any, and I'm just wondering, what is that drive that will bring individuals of color to Wilsonville?
We might have to think about that a little bit more. I mean, my first thought is that the lens that we're bringing to all of this is really about housing, and making sure that there's housing that's available, that's affordable for a wide range of needs. And the question you're asking is maybe more about city culture and services that are provided, and I'm things that go beyond the housing that is the focus of this report. But we can do some thinking about that.
Let me bring something else up that was in the report around housing, cost of housing. Average cost of housing, I believe, was around 200 and some, yet the, or affordability, I should say, of individuals, yet the housing we have here is around 400 and some. So when you look at that balance, and I think we need to really be thoughtful about that, because if we're planning for the growth, and you have other numbers in here on the growth of these particular groups, and it does center around housing, because if you don't have a job and it's not affordable for you to be able to have a home here, what's going to draw you to want to be here?
Right. In that situation, it would be access to subsidized affordable housing.
Okay. I think, for my taste, I think we need a little bit more deeper dive into that arena. I would love to see a little bit more on that.
Okay.
I was wrestling with myself. I read this and I was looking at, and I'm looking specifically at 1A, and I was having a visceral reaction to it, and I couldn't figure out why, but Commissioner Jerry here hit to the point, and that is, we're talking about equitable housing, we're talking about inclusion, and yet our primary 1A is locating housing that is in the middle of an industrial area. It is not in a residential area. And although, yeah, I see all the advantages of it because of the money and we own the land and everything, but I had a, like I said, a visceral reaction to it, and I couldn't figure it out for a while. But what it was is, it's like, okay, we're going to make some affordable housing, but guess what? It's going to be not where other people live. And I just had a really negative reaction to that. And I think that sends an extremely, I guess, prejudicial kind of message. And I'm sure there are ways around it. And I was thinking, okay, get beyond that. What are some ways around that? And I thought, wow, if it could be, affordable single houses or something. I mean, there's ways that it could be put together. But if we start to look at things like a large apartment complex or something, I just had some real concerns over that. And since it is our 1A, it set up red flags for me.
Yeah, that's really good feedback that's how that struck you. I think we were imagining it as being mixed income housing. That would be exactly the kind of inclusive communities that they were describing. And if that's not coming through, we'll need to revisit the language and make sure that that's there.
Okay.
The mixed income came through to me, and the first question that came up for me was, are we losing the nonprofit benefits that would come from this, maximizing the number of units that as a nonprofit the city could build on its own, as opposed to partnering with a developer who's for-profit, and so some of that money is going to become profits. So it's a mixed bag. And this, you're right, it's a mix of whether it's exclusive or inclusive. As I was listening to you, though, it looks to me like it depends on what else we have in the strategic plan. A transit-oriented development, which this will be, is a good step into the city. For those who don't have a job here, are commuting from wherever, and they don't need a car as a result, they can jump on the rail or whatever, or bus, and get to work. And then depending on what other steps of housing are available in the community, in a few years they can go there. So it could be a door to the community, depending on whether it's a dead end or whether it's not. So, go ahead.
So, yeah, thank you. I was also looking, thank you, Commissioner Milan. I was also looking at this site about the transit-oriented development, and I've had this thought before, but we really need to think about this area. Well, firstly, I think this site is actually very small. So the number of units is probably pretty small, and yet, we're creating a big message about this. There are adjacent sites that are currently industrial, and it is problematic. But we also need to realize where this location is, right between Villebois and the town centre.
Right.
And those two areas are obviously, well, Villebois is obviously residential, and town centre, as we know, is being redeveloped for multi-use. So is there opportunity to extend the town centre kind of thinking to this area, as in to develop this whole stretch or zone, this whole stretch perhaps, of Barber Street between the New Bridge town centre and the connection to Kinsman and the Barber Bridge over to Villebois. That area there seems like it's ripe for a different approach from what we currently have. It shouldn't be just purely industrial, and maybe we need to kind of start with this transit-oriented development, but have something bigger in mind that does connect up to the town centre. How we make that happen, I don't know, but I think we are the Planning Commission, and maybe we should suggest to our staff that we look at that approach of rethinking that particular area. Just the narrow band of Barber Street itself might be enough in that area.
And for the record, all the questions you all are raising about this are exactly the ones that would need to be answered in order to move forward with this action. So they're sort of immediate next steps in that development opportunity study that I described. It would need to understand the size of the site, how many units it could meaningfully accommodate, what its connections to the surrounding areas are that would need to be exploited, what the right mix of affordable to market rate unit types would need to be, how you position the property to attract a private developer or whether you work with a nonprofit. Those questions are not resolved yet and are outlined in the action as a set of next steps that would need to be taken within the time frame that we've outlined here to advance toward developing this site as a TOD site.
So thank you. I was going to turn around and address that question to you. What is the timeline for this this development opportunities study? Yeah. Is that the 2 years, or is that the beginning of the 2 years? Because that's just a study for what we can do here before we actually do anything.
I might have to look to Miranda for that one.
Thank you. Great question. Don't really have an answer quite yet to that. These are essentially the actions that are being outlined in the plan, are things for us that we could consider in the next couple of years. Those would be items that would then go into the city council once this plan is acknowledged and accepted by them and then adopted by them. As you know, our work program is set by the city council. So the city council every couple of years sets goals. One of the goals was this Equitable Housing Strategic Plan, which we will be adopting in this year. So the next time council goes to goal set, they would likely, or it's quite possible, they would look to this plan and look at what are the implementation items from that plan that they want to see fleshed out, assessed and implemented from that plan. And so we would get direction in terms of implementing items that are within this plan. So it could be all of the items that fall on that short list. It could be a portion of them. And as Lorelei mentioned, on a number of them, there's extra exploration that needs to occur in order for us to then know what is the policy that we adopt, the program we adopt, or development action that we would take on this site. So there would be timelines associated with that work as well. And as you know, we have a number of other items on the work program. So it's a balancing act that occurs, but it also happens through the direction that we would receive from the council on adoption of the plan or after adoption of the plan.
Yeah, I seem to have missed something here. I didn't understand that we were focusing so narrowly on the transit center opportunity. I thought that the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan pertained to the entire city, and we have a number of projects which it could touch on, which are actually quite active even in the 2-year frame. We have Frog Pond, most certainly. We have some infill going on. That doesn't affect us here in Planning Commission particularly, but the big thing is probably town center development in terms of its the variety of projects that are going to be going on in town center, which are amenable to mixed use and vertical solutions and so forth. So we're not just talking about this property over by Smart Central, are we?
No, that's just one of the action items that is identified in this plan, but there's a number of other ones that are aimed at other areas of the city or that are citywide.
So my comments really had to do with the broader, more global approach to our planning here. Certainly not overlooked, excuse me, not to be overlooked in the transit center development if that goes forward. But it should be an overarching concept that informs all of our planning, all of our residential planning in Wilsonville, it seems to me.
What I understood Commissioner Springall bringing up, and correct me if I misheard you, is if we are going to have a satellite residential development or mixed residential development as a TOD here, then is that opening that corridor between two other very active, potentially residential, in one case, town center, and the other one already residential? Is it creating a corridor of more intensive, redesigned development in that area? And that analysis would be part of figuring out what to do with that parcel, I would think, because I understand what your concern is. It would be a waste of an opportunity for that whole corridor if we just focus on that island and miss everything else.
Yes.
Exactly.
And typically what happens when you have a satellite development like that and a financial kind of impetus in an area, the surrounding properties start feeling like they want to do something as well. If they are more commercial or more industrial, they will become more intensive commercial and industrial, not necessarily residential, unless we start thinking ahead of time and design for it and kind of lead that opportunity. So that's what I thought you were bringing up.
Yeah, I mean, transit-oriented development is a great concept. This one site here is not big enough. I mean, yes, it's a great start, but we can extend that concept along that whole little corridor and connect up to town center and to Villeroy.
Or at least create a node out of it.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Very good.
We'll make sure to reflect that in the description of the next steps to explore that possibility.
So my bigger question, not to belabor 1A any longer than we have and not talk about performance measures, I shared some of the same reactions as Commissioner Millen to this, and I have for a while, because it just it's an island. And so if we are going to do something more radical and make it part of a larger plan, that's great. From I guess a short-term question, my thought was, do we have a better piece of city-owned property that is more better suited for a development that's still transit-oriented, is still on a current line, but is more in line with having opportunities, services, and amenities? This site has transit. It's a half a mile from the closest park. It's 3/4 of a mile from the closest grocery store. It doesn't have access to everything else that we would consider a community.
So one of the longer term actions that we have really looks at bigger picture, taking stock of city-owned properties and starting to think about where there might be opportunities with city-owned land, either to, at some point, maybe develop a strategy to acquire land to facilitate the development of housing, or to think about areas where the city currently owns land and if there are any opportunities there in the future. So that the concept is reflected in the plan. Why it falls in that longer term category is that we know, at least on our current radar, that there's nothing that would immediately, that we would be able to get this ball rolling on in the next couple of years. So, one example is the property general complex in this area here. We own a good amount of land, but we know that there's existing leases and other plans for other city agencies to, ultimately relocate. And we know that it's not something, it could be a longer term vision, and we want to have it on our radar, potentially in light of the town center plan and opportunities that will come about with that. So we have accounted for that in this plan. It's just not something, it's kind of a distinct and separate idea from the one that was raised on this particular site.
Okay. I'm just concerned that we focus our efforts on this and miss a larger opportunity to make a more impactful development that has more of the qualities that we would expect from a development in Wilsonville.
Thank you. And I think maybe we might want to take that longer term action and potentially highlight maybe a little more in that, just noting the opportunities to future services and current services that there might be there.
Any other comments?
Yeah. I have a couple technical questions. There's a page given to vertical housing development zones. Do we have such a zone in Wilsonville presently?
No.
Is this being proposed that we consider having such a zone?
Correct. This would be proposed potentially as a tool. Again, nothing that we would define within the adoption of this plan, but to think about how that might be one tool that we could identify certain areas in the city where maybe that is a good funding mechanism to try to encourage that type of mixed-use development.
It seems to be especially applicable to a town center.
Yes.
That's our thinking as well.
And just a little detail. In the discussion, one of the cons, that is the arguments against, I guess that's what con means here, the vertical housing development zone, is that it can't qualify until the project is under construction. Why would that be?
Are you, you're in the appendix?
Am I in the appendix? That's true, I'm in Appendix D. About being in the weeds.
I suspect that has to do with when, there's different parts of the development process. I suspect that has to do with when the developer can actually get the tax abatement, the certainty of the tax abatement. And we can look into that a little more and figure out what the specificity of that is.
Yeah, and I think this might actually be referring, this is confusing. You've put your finger on something that's a little bit confusing, because I think this might actually be referring to the establishment of the VHDZ and not to the project under construction, creating uncertainty for developers. So thanks for highlighting that. I think there's something wrong with that bullet, and we'll go and look at it and figure it out.
One more?
Go ahead.
Okay. One of the other things that caught my attention was in 1C, the define the equitable housing approaches in new urban growth areas, and especially when it said add sidebar information on Villebois history. One of the things, and I think it might be worthwhile, because Villebois initially was conceived as having so many different kinds of housing types that there would be, I guess, even affordable housing in there.
And distributed.
And somehow in the implementation, that fell apart. And even though there are different kinds of housing, you know, single detached and et cetera, they're all about the same price. They're not different prices. They're all, you know, on the higher end. And I'm just kind of hoping that maybe we get to what went wrong to help us put some things in place with the new development that would keep us from going there. I mean, because you have this nice idea, but somehow it in implementation, when the rubber met, you know, when they started building all the units up there, it got lost. And how can we ensure that it doesn't get lost, I guess is what I'm looking for, is how do you build into your master plan a little more solidity to keep that idea in place and not get lost based on market. And that's, it seems to me, is what happened. It was just, you know, the market was there and took advantage of it. And, you know, because they could build it and they will come. I mean, it didn't matter what we were charging here in Wilsonville for a while. People came because it's a desirable community. So what is it that went kind of wrong there that kept that from happening? Because the vision had a lot more diversity in terms of the type and pricing of homes. And that doesn't seem to be the case that happened there.
But is that really the case? I mean, we can go back and look at the Villebois master plan and look at the housing types that were identified and compare that to what was actually developed. We have apartments in Villebois, we have row houses, we have single family detached houses, we have cottage houses. I'm just not sure if that's really the case, that we actually didn't implement what we said we were going to.
Okay.
Yeah, it's 11 of the 13 housing types were actually built. And the two that weren't had to do with condos, redoing the old damaged building, which ended up not being feasible, and the buildings needed to be taken down. But in the end, there were 11, I believe, of the 13 housing types that were actually built.
So it had something more to do then with, I don't know, the market pushing the costs up there versus the variety? Because again, if one thinks about a row house, should that be the same as a single family house? And yet they are. I mean, you know, a unit there is kind of similar. So I don't know, there was just, to me, something that, some learnings there that might be useful to us in terms of when we're looking at our future master plans, solidifying a bit more that we want this, truly want this mix, and how are we going to ensure that that happens? And that may be with our partnerships with nonprofits, it may be with some other things, but I think there needs to be some firmer guidelines, I guess, in the master planning.
That's helpful.
Thank you.
No, that actually I don't think we're going to get to all the questions we had tonight, but that actually kind of captures one of the ones we did have, which was how do you look at, just those things you mentioned, not only planning for the mix, but really focusing on unit type and configuration and things that, so we are asking those questions. So I think that's a really good suggestion. So thank you.
One of the things that the Planning Commission does well is to get in the weeds. And the detail is in the weeds.
Yeah.
And this issue brings up one of the things that I wish we had as an overview in selecting options. The variables that set a price for a unit are land and the type of construction that you're having there. So you can have a row house that is $400 a square foot, as opposed to $200 a square foot. That's going to be out of range. So and land is another thing in a couple of these options that has been brought up as, land is an important, significant cost for housing. And that leads us to think about land banks and so forth. There is no statement here that tells us what proportionalities these have. Is half the cost as a variable the land? Or is it only quarter? It depends on how high you go. So density becomes another variable. So you have three variables here interacting with one another. How many of these can the city control? If you own the land, you're controlling that. If you have an affordable unit that's built at $200 a square foot, and I buy it and I put $200 worth of per square foot worth of improvements in it, now it's not affordable anymore for the next buyer. How do we control that?
And it's very different for town center and for Frog Pond East.
Because they're new.
Well, Frog Pond East is on former farmland.
Yes.
Town center is on currently developed and occupied land and income producing land.
Yes. So a picture of what these kind of interaction of these variables are in explanation for our public outreach or something would be helpful, so that the strategies that we come up with can be tied to it. This controls for land value, which is important at this kind of a level. This controls for ownership and maintaining that affordability in perpetuity or for a certain number of years, and this is why that's important. And educational outreach that is clarifying for those who are trying to wrap their head around it. Any other comments? So this was a pause, you thought, for the second part of your presentation.
So I think, just in light of the fact that we do have another item on the agenda, and I don't want to keep Dan here all night, and Miranda and everybody else. I think the one key piece that we could maybe use just a few more suggestions on would be this, which is performance measures. And we got a lot of good ideas from the task force meeting, actually, so we've included those in the packet. I think if, in maybe 5 to 10 minutes, if there's anything else that we think of or that you all think would be really helpful to track so that, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, we can see, to what degree we're actually being successful. I think we can kind of just, if there are any other ideas you want to throw out there.
And I'd say we have a list of, I don't know, I can't count that, 13 maybe. That's probably more than you want to track. So it would also be important to know which ones you don't think are useful.
Where are you looking at? Yeah.
So on page 20, this has been developed in an iterative process. So on page 22 of the actual, sorry, what is it on your packet? Page 22 of this strategy document. Sorry, I don't have the packet page numbers.
So page 39 of 63 is the part of the plan that it's in, but then also the task force summary is on
Page 60.
Page 60.
Yeah, page 60.
That one I do have, yeah, page 60. Yeah. So we drafted this document, we took it to the task force, we had a robust conversation with them about potential suggestions for additional measures. We included those in your packet as well that came out of the task force. So we've got this list of things. And I think, overall what we're looking for are measures that are indicators of whether the goals, the policy objectives are being achieved, that can be tracked with relative simplicity and data that are available to kind of not partially to measure success, but also just to make sure that things are headed in the right direction and to identify where more action will be needed as you get into later phases of implementation.
So a couple of comments. I mean, for me, one thing that, when I look, we've got 7 policy objectives. So at a minimum, we should have 7 performance measures, one for each policy objective. And there might be some that require more. It would be nice to have that direct correlation that says,
Yeah, that's a good
here's the
idea.
policy objective, here's your performance measure.
Yep.
And from my background, the policy objectives are great. I struggle with them without goals, discrete goals in terms of what do you mean by greater availability of diversity of housing types? If you have a performance measure that is looking at number, location, and types of homes produced, what's good? What's bad? What does the city want to see? Do we want to see 5 new homes produced? Do we want to see 5,000? How do we know what success is without having a number to bound it? Those would be the 2 comments that I would have. In addition to this, maybe looking at, because the city is going to have to spend money in some way, shape, or form, whether it's tax abatements, whether it's SDCs, what is our goal? What do we want to spend as a city, and are we tracking that in terms of performance measure? If we're expecting to spend $50,000 a unit and we end up spending $100,000, that's something we should be paying attention to so that we can correct it sooner rather than later.
One of the things about indicators and metrics that you touched on, Commissioner Eberlein, is to learn from it. It's an iterative goal setting. And it needs to have some cost effectiveness associated with this. So if we're not doing 50,000, we're spending 100,000, are we getting twice as much for it? What is the cost benefit? Maybe 100,000 gives us 3 times more, and maybe it's worthwhile. But in trying to correct it or adjust it, we need to be in a learning mode from what is happening. So indicators need to be telling us how well we're doing the metrics for these indicators. And since we have been inching towards having a trends analysis capability in our housing reports, it would be good to tie it into our housing report, because the city's housing report on an annual basis is tracking a whole bunch of these things that could then be producing metrics that are related to the specific goals of the strategic plan. Not passively, though. I want it to be active. It needs to be tracked on an annual basis and reevaluated on an annual basis, and the goals reaffirmed or adjusted and then affirmed. So we are not going to be 10 years down the line and finding out that we had wishful thinking and it didn't happen and we spent a lot of effort in it. Any other ideas on indicators and metrics?
Well, I can say the task force had a lot of ideas, and I'm not sure we can do better than that. I think we need to try to focus. I think associating them with the policy objectives is a great idea, and you need to. There's some of these task force suggestions that are quite reasonable and helpful, but some of them may be very specific and less generally applicable. But I don't think I have anything new.
So in my experience of metrics, you have a lot of nitty-gritty that is generated.
Yeah.
And then when the experts get into it, they can reduce a list of 10 to one metric that answers all of those, and also ties to one of your options. So that's the task. That's where the big money is.
Those are always ratios. So they're not just one metric. There are lots of metrics
Right.
or indices. It's cheating, but possible.
Just a small aside, in my next incarnation after Multnomah County Public Welfare, I found myself in charge of a set of programs in Boston for low-income access, I should say low-income success, and federal programs. And in those days, the mantra was management by objective. I got sick of MBO. That was thrown at us constantly. But the crux of it is that you have objectives, and then you have a metric for measuring how well you've met them. And I do think that this is important for us to have. It should be easily updatable and paid attention to on an annual basis.
And ideally, those goals or those metrics have some teeth to them, because there's cautionary tales of developers coming in and very well-intended policies have loopholes where they don't get met. And so if there's some way to really get some teeth into them, that would be good too. But I don't have any suggestions for that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Enforceable metrics.
Maybe that's the word I'm looking for.
So I hope we didn't scare you.
Easy peasy.
I just have two other comments, and one is that on the key findings, back when you were talking with people, there was a concern about HOA fees and property taxes, kind of pushing people who now are, it's affordable, but it won't be, but nothing that we're looking at doing here talks about that at all. I'm just, and since that was a key finding coming out of what people were saying, it seems like, and I'm not sure what we can do about, I mean, it's one of those that's really hard to come up with a metric around, but it is something that we at least ought to, if we don't have an implementation, we ought to at least acknowledge that we are aware of this, but it's one of those things that's a little harder to tackle. Okay. And then the second question, I guess, is as much to you as to the city. I know there is the new bill, and it's coming down, and we have to, are we within good timeframes here of being able to implement our own strategy versus what the state might dictate to us?
Well, your next agenda item will go into great detail about this question.
Okay. Great segue.
Do you have any other questions from us?
I think that we'll cut it off here for now, but there were a couple of other questions that are in that PowerPoint handout. And so certainly if you have thoughts on any of those that you want to communicate to us directly, we're happy to hear them. Feel free to email those to either Miranda or myself. And we will be, as I mentioned, going to the City Council in March. And so, we'll be getting some more of their input there. But, we are really appreciative, even though, sometimes you get a little off script. I feel like all of the ideas and all of the comments you shared with us tonight are really valuable and important. And they're something that we can take back and work into the final version of the plan.
So what two questions didn't you get to ask?
Oh, they were just specific action questions, more like trying to generate more ideas for any key steps. And I think some of these, honestly, financial incentives for missing middle housing planning. I mean, I think Dan will have a lot of opportunities to talk about that too as he gets into that project. Same thing with new urban growth areas. We did touch on this one. This was the one I mentioned. And so I think the fact that, we've acknowledged that this is really important, I think, we can really kind of hone some of that language a little more, that we know that when we're looking at this in Frog Pond, that we want to be very thoughtful about these things so that perhaps we achieve a different outcome than what we experienced in Villebois. And then what else did I have in here? Oh yeah, there's the accessibility and visitability standards as well. This really comes out of the aging in place piece of things. There are a number of varying degree of standards that you can apply and or require and or recommend. And so I think we've heard that this is important. I think we just kind of need to bolster for the final plan some of the questions that we think we want to ask.
And to be clear, this one falls in the to explore category, not the next 2 years. But we still want to define the kinds of questions that need to be asked and answered. So we'd be happy to take your comments by email or whatever.
Yeah. I mean,
And
if there's anything-
this was also a big, long topic of discussion in the town center redevelopment. Because the idea was that as people get older and don't want to be in their single-family housing, they would be rather downtown within walking distance of all kinds of amenities in some condo and so forth. So that those two projects are, this and that project would tie together here. But if people are insisting on being able to maintain a single family that is difficult to maintain as you get older, that's a different question.
Yes, and I think there's a place for both. There's certainly people who just want to stay in their home, and there are things you can do to make a single-family home. There are ways you can design a single-family home to make that not have to be a consideration. So I think that's where that potentially gets really important, and thinking about new areas and new standards that we're creating. So these actions there is a lot of overlap in a way, but same thing with a multifamily building that, even if that is a one-level living situation, that you still want to have features in there that make it easy for somebody to get around. So that's really what this notion speaks to.
At the risk of seeming like the captain who had only one notion for crossing the ocean, I'd like to circle back to what is equitable housing definition on page 3 of the PowerPoint. Diverse, high quality, physically accessible, reasonably priced, close to opportunities, services, and amenities. I just would like to see added in there in some term, may not be this term, well distributed in the community.
Inclusion, the notion of inclusion.
And I'm assuming high quality means good design as well.
Yeah.
And I know we're trying to desperately jump off of this onto the next topic. Miranda is, and I guess this may be a question for you guys to think about, is there enough discussion that needs to be had around this plan before it goes to council that we should revisit and answer the rest of these questions? Or do we need to take homework and respond via email to the rest of the questions?
She's looking at me. I mean, I think we do. We know that we're going to ask similar questions probably of council. I mean, particularly, I think the big goal for them is going to be focusing in on the performance measures and objectives. But I think what we will be doing when we go there is being able to summarize what we've heard and provide them with that information to include it in the draft plan. If there are suggestions, I don't know that that's going to impact their ability to review and provide us draft feedback on this draft on March 2nd. So I think we're still in good shape with that. That being said, if something strikes you next week, 2 weeks from now, we're happy to hear it as we move forward in finalizing that draft.
If it's not obvious, the questions that we were bringing forward in the PowerPoint are the ones that we, in your role as planning commission with your planning commission hat on, that might show up for you in the future if council adopts this plan. So we were wanting to make sure that those pieces that were really most likely to have nexus with your work plan and your decision-making process made sense to you. So if there's anything in there, if you're thinking it's a year down the road, this thing comes in front of you and you're going to not like it, that's the kind of stuff we want to hear about. And I think an email would be helpful along those lines.
That being said, the questions and next steps that we're posing, they're not set in stone. We know that as we go forward with any of these projects, particularly the ones that relate to construction, building, planning, that these conversations are going to be had here in more depth. And, we'll really have more opportunities and more details to ask those questions. And, I think we need to just have enough of a framework in this plan that we know the key considerations and questions that are important that give us guidance moving forward. So if we haven't captured every thought, every question, there's always going to be more questions because things change constantly. And the situation in which we're working in 2 years could be different than what we're dealing with now, and we're going to always have more questions or thoughts to consider.
So if we completely change our minds by the public hearing, you won't be upset. That's good to know.
Notice she didn't answer that question.
Silence.
So the thing is, we always have the opportunity to, at the public hearing, if there are changes or, even wording modifications or something, as a part of your final recommendation, we are able to incorporate those into a final document. So
Wonderful.
thank you.
Work very well done, I think. This is developing into a very nice strategic plan.
I agree.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for your comments and time tonight.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Take it away.
All right, well, I will introduce the next item. As Commissioner Millen helped segue this, some of you may have been tracking the last legislative session, others may not have. There was a briefing, I believe, in November or December, but not all of our commissioners were on board at that time. So for those that weren't tracking, two very important bills related to housing passed in the state legislature this past session in 2019, House Bill 2001 and House Bill 2003. Both were passed as a result of trying to address some statewide housing needs, some might call housing emergency, and they relate to a couple different things. One, housing production in general, which is the focus of House Bill 2003, and then the production of middle housing or a variety of housing types beyond just detached single family or multifamily. So in some communities, there's kind of two distinct zoning types. We have been lucky in Wilsonville that we have a lot of neighborhoods that have detached single family alongside a lot of middle housing types. And that has not really been an issue with a lot of our zoning. However, that is not necessarily the case statewide. And so House Bill 2001 really was looking at how to increase the variety of housing types in neighborhoods that were traditionally zoned single family. So with the passage of that bill, pretty much every jurisdiction in the state got assigned the homework of looking at their zoning code and finding out what limitations they have and how those zoning codes need to change, development codes need to change in order to encompass and allow the middle housing types that the state legislature is wanting to see us allow. And the city was actually involved during the process of the forming of those bills. We did participate and testify. We're very supportive of the overall goal of these bills and helped to try to modify the language to make it kind of best case outcome and formulate the language around those bills. So at this point, where we're at with this project is the state really has guided us to either adopt something by June of 2022, and Dan will get into more detail, or we would go with the model code, which is what Commissioner Milan was getting at. And so staff has spent the last probably 4 months really reviewing the bills and then reviewing our code and trying to think about how do we want to approach this project that was handed to us by the state. And as you know, we have a lot of other projects that we are working on, fulfilling council goals and other projects that we've been pursuing over the last few years. So Dan's going to go into detail, or I don't know if it's detailed.
Not too much detail.
Not too much detail. Dan's going to cover the discussions we've had so far and some of our approach, because what we want to do is build on the great work we've done with the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan and with the work of the Town Center and the existing work we've done throughout the city over the years to try to create a diversity of housing types, and take that information, do this work, do it to the best practices. That's our MO here in Wilsonville, is not to just do what we need to kind of check the box, but instead to really think about it and figure out what makes the most sense for our community and is along the lines of best practices moving forward. So that's the work that we've outlined, and we're going to talk a bit about how we're going to bridge that between the work that we're wrapping up now on housing, as well as our future planning work in Frog Pond East and South, and kind of how this will connect the two. And really what we're here tonight to kind of is to provide some more context of our understanding, inform you of where we're at in terms of our thought process around this project, outline what our general approach will be and the general timing of how we're hoping this will roll out. Part of this will be dependent on funding. So this wasn't something that was in the work program. It came from the state. There are funding resources with the state, but the grant application for that is currently open. So we're looking to the state and other sources to try to find funding for some of this project. So we're going to kind of outline some of that information for you tonight to bring you up to speed, but really to also get your input on the approach. We want to know what kind of your thoughts are, given all the multiple pieces that we have moving in the city related to this issue, and if we're missing anything, what you'd like to see added to that approach, especially if we are able to get funding to do the work. So with that, I feel like I've taken up enough time already and hopefully not stolen too much of Dan's thunder. And I'll let Dan take it away.
Thanks, Miranda. So Miranda gave a great description of kind of the legislative background, but in the end, really there's two main actions that it requires for House Bill 2001. First of all, the duplexes are allowed on each lot that allows a single family home. And the second one being middle housing, which is triplexes, fourplexes, cottage clusters, and row houses are allowed in area zone for residential use. That area zone for residential use is still something that's being defined through rulemaking, which we'll be interested to see what the state decides what that means. And as described by Miranda as well, there's that option of just defaulting to the state model code by not doing anything, or looking at best practices and doing something tailored that is the best option for Wilsonville. And as is our MO, we're recommending we go with this tailored approach and make sure that the implementation of and compliance is consistent with with the community and our plans and excuse me. So really what then is that we have to look at for compliance? There's quite a few things under this umbrella that we need to examine, or that includes probably most obviously the comprehensive plan and the development code, but also going to need to look at a lot of our legislative master plans, including Frog Pond, the area plan and the Frog Pond West master plan, as well as Villabois. Certainly more emphasis on Frog Pond since there's a lot more houses to be built there still, as well as our infrastructure master plans. All of those are under this umbrella of what we anticipate looking at to ensure that we're complying with House Bill 2001. So the context is important here, and I want to emphasize that this is really flowing together rather nicely in a way. So we're taking that you see in this slide both 1B and 1C all kind of coming together. Where we're taking 1B and doing the middle housing project, and then from there going and even overlapping some with 1C and Frog Pond East and South. And so as we connect those, the timing is going to need to be right around state rulemaking and model code adoption. Make sure that what we're doing interrelate well with those. So keeping kind of this slide in mind, I want to show you the actual dates of the timeline, where we're moving spring this year as we finish up the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan, beginning to work on this project. And then later this year. Right now, DLCD is telling us that they plan on having rulemaking, the majority of the rulemaking, as well as the model code adoption done by December of this year. And then right after that, we're already moving into work on Frog Pond. Today, I worked on all three of these projects, so it's really on my mind on how they're all interrelating. Then early 2022, we'll look at adopting this project, any code changes, et cetera, associated with that. And 6 months later, adopting the Frog Pond East and South components. There's a couple deadlines associated with this that are pretty hard, that we're giving ourselves a 6-month buffer before each of these. So June 30, 2022 is the deadline for compliance with House Bill 2001. And then December 2022 is the deadline for adoption of Frog Pond East and South per the Metro ordinance that did the UGB addition. So where's the money coming from? That's a great question. So we've been working with DLCD and been in communication about a grant program from funding they got from the 2019 legislative session. And we anticipate, we're hopeful, and indications are we will get some funds there. We won't know for sure until later this spring, but that's our hope. And we're also exploring some additional options through the variety of Metro grant programs. Adding to the grants, there's the existing staff time and budgeting staff time to do it, as well as using some of our existing professional services budget for consulting. We're also are talking to administration and proposing an add package to the 2020-21 budget for additional professional services to make sure that we have the funds we need to do it the way that's going to best serve the community. So with that, what are really the products or the components of the project? It starts with the audit. Really looking through all those items under the umbrella and seeing where changes may need to happen. And that will result in the final product there would be recommended text changes for adoption, for review by the Planning Commission and City Council from the development plan, the development code, the comprehensive plan, and those legislative master plans. And then a memo recommending updates to the infrastructure master plans. We don't anticipate through this project actually getting into those infrastructure master plans. There's a lot of modeling and stuff involved there, but making recommendations that next time those are opened up, that we have a memo guiding how these changes need to be addressed. So really, with all those moving pieces, this audit and recommendation process would be broken down into 3 phases. Starting as soon as the funding is available, we can really get started on the initial audit, anticipating some of what is likely to come out of rulemaking, identifying where any of these documents really tie to that only allowing single-family homes. And through that audit, we anticipate some questions will come up, particularly about these past documents, and we'll need to likely do, as the second phase, some targeted outreach to stakeholders involved in those previous planning efforts. And then once we have the results of the audit, we should have the state rulemaking and model code, as well as the results of the outreach. We can really go into then in 2021, the actual recommendations and getting those solidified with drafts during the first quarter, then finalizing for adoption by the end of 2021. The second part is more of the go above and beyond, and really important is really looking at design and siting standards. How, and this will be the focus of a robust public involvement process, really looking at how design standards can apply to a variety of housing at the same time to maintain a quality of design and make sure, on a street or in a neighborhood, a variety of housing can all be compatible and work together and maintain the sort of communities that we value. And this will be happening again, mostly during 2021, getting ready for the adoption of this whole package in early 2022. And the final piece would be the infrastructure funding methods. There's discussion of this in the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan, as well as requirements related to this as conditions of approval for the UGB expansion. And this is looking at the variety of options for funding, includes exploring variable SDCs for different housing types and sizes, and really aiming to look at reducing and minimizing impact on the cost of housing. And just with the timing and particular additional discussions about this as we work through it, looking at this being a final step during 2022, even possibly going beyond the adoption of those other documents, and which may mean during some of those other documents, as we look at funding, we may need to look at different alternatives depending on how we end up figuring out different SDC methodologies. So I'll pause for any questions on those items from the commission. Then I have a few questions I'd like to ask the commission.
How and by whom will it be determined that we're in compliance?
It would be decided by DLCD staff.
They'll comb through our documents and.
Oh, yes.
As you do so ably.
Yeah, so we anticipate, that the state will be looking at and reviewing these changes to make sure they're in compliance.
Right.
Is that what the audit is for as well?
Yeah, well, the audit would be us looking through that lens of the state, of what the state requirements are, as well as other things. I imagine there's components of the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan that will also be able to incorporate into that audit process.
So they're not looking at your audit, that's internal?
Yeah, that's us hiring a consultant. It's similar to like what we did for like the commercial recreation in the industrial zone. We're really looking at where the issues are in the code that we need to address.
As this was dropped on us by the state, and of course additional funding is needed, and you guys are already working on that. I'm wondering what will happen, or have we looked at what we'll need to do if we have a funding shortfall?
We've looked at different, phasing and different alternatives and what we would prioritize based on funding. And we're ready to have those conversations as needed.
Okay.
So to add just a little bit of detail to that, I would say that the first component, which is essentially the code audit and having a really good understanding of where if we don't kind of meet what's outlined in House Bill 2001, that the code audit is really for us the understanding of, are there changes that have to be made? And so that's the critical step that we need to conduct. And then making modifications in order to come into compliance is what our goal would be. And that is kind of the critical piece, and the piece that at minimum we hope to receive funding for or be able to do with staff funding or other funding through the budget process in order to at least get that piece done. If we fall short of that, then the model code that the state adopts is what would come into place. So if we don't have an alternative in place by June of 2022, then the state's model code is what would come into place. The other pieces that Dan described in the work program are the additional components that we think are necessary in order to really make this up to best practices and to really get us where we want to go, and not just sort of adopt language that allows, but also maybe goes a step further and is trying to really promote that diversity of housing types and has architectural design standards that are also affordable, to really make sure that we're trying to remove barriers as well as much as we can. So those additional pieces are the pieces that we hope to receive additional funding for in order to kind of go that extra step. But that's sort of the breakdown in terms of what we see as kind of the order of magnitude if we don't receive all the funding.
I applaud what you just said.
Yeah.
To be clear, this pertains to future development and redevelopment. It has no impact on existing stock.
It could. So it will apply to everywhere in the city. Granted that a majority of the city, the planned development residential zones already allow a variety, and they're kind of tied by the previous land use approvals, and many of them tied by private covenants as well, that would limit any code, the impact of any code changes, similar to how the code changes that we're doing right now on the residential modernization technically apply to all those zones, but don't have an impact because of the existing land use approvals, et cetera.
There's also a component of House Bill 2001 related to conversions, I believe, and there's a component of the state that's going to be working on building code, I think, related to conversions. So that is also, but that's still in progress.
Yeah, because that really gets down to that once you go beyond the 2 units, you get into commercial building code. And how do you address that barrier that if you have a 3,000 square foot house and want to turn it into a triplex and not be pushed into a much more complicated, expensive building code? So those are big questions that need to be answered in that realm, and that the State Building Codes Division has been directed to work on.
Any other question, comments?
So the goals of the House bill are relating to middle housing. Is it around, I assume it's around price point, middle price point, as well as size and shape and function.
Right.
But is there any language that we need to add? Because I'm not hearing that from the description so far, is that emphasis on the price point. Because to your point earlier, that you can have a duplex with high-end finishes and completely change the price point.
The code the state law, as I understand, doesn't particularly address price point. It really, I think, makes some assumptions that the unit type and size will to some level drive price point.
Carrera Marble.
That would be something that might be a priority then, that we may want to add to it, is if that is a goal of the city for best practices.
See, I watch entirely too much HGTV.
Don't we all?
Retirement's great, right?
The goal of the state in all of this really isn't that different from where the city kind of views ourselves at this point. Is it? I mean, I don't see it that far out of alignment. Am I misunderstanding it or simplifying it too much?
I think, the city's already doing a lot of efforts on housing. I think especially when you start talking about House Bill 2003 and the housing needs analyses and the housing production strategies, we're already doing a lot of that type of work. House Bill 2001 certainly has, where a lot of the city does allow a variety of housing, and of course, Villaball, we've allowed a variety of housing. Certainly, there are, we'll see through the audit, but there's likely some areas that need to be affected. One where a lot of Frog Pond West, for example, is identified for a single family. If every lot in the city that allows a single family needs to allow a duplex, that is one example that would need to be addressed.
Where are we in this process in comparison with our neighbor cities?
It depends on the neighbor city,
let's say
which would probably,
Tualatin, Laco, West Lynn, let's say.
so there's some cities that haven't done much. Other cities in the region, like particularly like Beaverton and Tiger, that are along on this path, have, like Tiger in January adopted new development code that addresses a lot of this in terms of different housing types and allows. So they were already working on this well before the house code, as well as Beaverton has an active project on this, while others haven't done much, if anything. So.
Dan, in attachment 1, in the draft project goals and objectives, the third paragraph talks about a major component of the recommended project is to modify the 2017 Frog Pond West Master Plan to comply with HB 2001. Given that I live right across from Frog Pond West and see the pace of the development going on right now, in current state, what is the land use approval? This report was listed as 197 of 500 planned lots. Is that current state? That there's over a third, almost a half of the development has already been permitted, essentially?
Correct.
Okay. So our ability to influence Frog Pond West or revise it is quickly disappearing.
Correct. And that said, that if there's something in that ends up being advantageous to a developer, there's nothing saying they can't come back and revise their plan.
Okay.
But whatever the applications come in and for land use approval prior to the effective date of these ordinance, likely in, probably May or March to April of 2022 would be under the current standards.
Have there been any communications with developers regarding our potential changes and the impact to the Frog Pond West neighborhood and potential build options?
Well, I think first it would be the audit to really understand what the scale of what we're looking at is. And then as part of that phase 2 outreach would be to, I would imagine, for example, maybe to the neighbors and the developers, et cetera, that are currently involved or were involved in that master planning process.
But nobody's been coming knocking at the city's door asking for, hey, can I have this?
No.
Okay.
I hesitate to ask the next question. Should we anticipate a need to revisit topics like setbacks and parking?
Absolutely. I think that siting and design standards will absolutely look at those sorts of issues. And particularly parking, and how can parking be designed to, specifically if you have a lot that has multiple units, how can parking be designed to be compatible and work without being overly onerous?
So you can see why I'm hesitant to bring it up.
It'll be a robust community conversation.
And this is essentially, in the variables we were talking about the previous presentation, this deals with density, basically, right?
Or the perception of density.
You're right. Same thing. Good. That's why, price point and all of that is not part of this.
Yeah.
Could be.
Could be.
Are you leaving that open?
It's not a requirement by the state legislation, but our understanding of the policy, or not policy objective, but the action item coming out of the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan would be for us to look at it with that lens as we go into this work, so that if we are looking at design standards, we're not looking at things that are going to add a lot of cost to these middle housing types, that we're aware of the implications of those decisions, and that there's, while we don't control the market, that we're hopefully being mindful so that we could have these housing types at more affordable price points.
Based on the city's requirements,
Yes,
but not anything more.
but we don't control the market, so.
That's true. I'm seeing these as distinct elements of a whole that we are dealing with separately because we have to, because of the number of planners we have and the time and the money and this, that, and the other thing. Otherwise, we would be looking at the whole thing holistically, right? All at once. Throw everything in the kitchen sink at it. It's the issue of development of a fast-growing urban area in all of its aspects, essentially, which is hard to deal with. So you end up segmenting it. I just don't want to have these arbitrary lines between these things when they're supposed to be integrated. I mean, our equitable housing basically says any decision that we make on housing is going to have a lens of equity. Not just the stuff the city is requiring, but planning decisions go beyond what the city requires as an element of zoning or whatever.
And I think to the extent, so I think one of the things that we'd like to hear from you, especially tonight, is if you have ideas about how we integrate that into the work program. Obviously, there's the component of what we have to do, and but we would like to go beyond what we have to do. And we really would like to get the resources to do that. And that could be pausing on other priorities in order to make this happen. It could be in getting additional funding. We're trying all of those things. So if you do have ideas on how we approach this in a way that addresses affordability to a greater extent, or looks at equity and inclusion to a greater extent than it would otherwise, those are things we want to hear from you. And we would like to integrate that into the work program if we're able to have that type of robust work program. Because we, as a city, and that we're on the record testifying to this in front of the state, is that we do believe in this, and that by producing middle housing types, you don't necessarily obtain affordable housing, or even housing that's at more affordable price points. You can see that all over Portland. The overall goal, however, is good. The more supply and the more supply of diversity will get you eventually to having more availability across the board, and folks who maybe are taking up a more affordable house, who could afford to be in a townhome, even if it is on the expensive side, can do that, and then open up that more affordable house for somebody else who really needs that price point. So it's all interrelated, but there's also a way of doing middle housing that is more affordable, I think, and I think that's what we'd like to do. So this is the time for us to try to be creative and think about how to integrate what we're learning through the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan and integrate that into this work program as much as we can. So we want, and those ideas, if they come out tonight or in the next couple months, but we want this dialogue with you to continue and for us to be able to integrate that into the work program as much as possible.
Well, that's why I bring up the cost factors that we discussed in the Equitable.
And I've had that thought about cost as well. It's because, yeah, it is an important component.
Well, what it does, though, Dan, is it creates openings for the city strategically. It says, all right, we don't control the market, but if we can buy land and have middle housing that we partner with nonprofits to build affordably, then that creates within that range of housing an affordable section that's not subject to market forces. Otherwise, the city may not see that as an opening, as a strategic opening. And a lot of these things, in some applications in the country, the same house that is a single family in the same neighborhood, the same design, it looks the same way, but it has 4 units in it. So
Yeah.
there are ways of dealing with design and dealing with position as you're working on here. The variable that is missing is whether or not you're going to have a developer who wants to do that. Well, then you start thinking about Habitat and nonprofits and others, and then the cost of land. And if the city owns it, maybe the development costs are different as well, because it's a city project. There are a number of things that then start leading to one another, is all I'm saying.
Yeah. There's a lot of interrelation. Yeah.
Not being familiar with all the planning tools that you might have, is it ever explored where there's variable incentives based on the market for them to build a certain housing type for the developers? I guess what I'm thinking here is what levers do you have to pull that if the market, based on the market at the time of the development, to incentivize one type of construction or one price point over another?
We historically haven't really used that type of tool, but it's certainly something that's laid out in the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan that is one of those things to explore. And certainly as we look at SDCs and how, because SDCs are a large ticket item, and variable SDCs, how that could affect what developers choose to build and can make a profit on.
So Dan, you've had key questions for the commission on here for just a little while. I figure we should try to veer back towards those. My question is related towards those middle 2 bullets. I'm going to ignore the first one right now because I can't think of key stakeholder groups. You're asking for overlooked concerns and priorities, but I don't recall you having listed any priorities or concerns that we could add on to know what's been overlooked.
It goes, this presentation was a summary, but if you go into the attachment, it goes into a bit more. I mean, the concerns, public opinion and perception, design compatibility, policies that are in need of updating that can be barriers, provision of adequate infrastructure,
Parking and transportation.
Parking and transportation.
So whether listed or whether we overlooked something, I guess we're just interested in whether you have specific concerns or priorities for what we look at through this work program.
Yeah, I guess from a priority standpoint, my only priority would be making sure that we do what's right for the city that is in line with our beliefs. And I think that in general that should be achievable given a lot of what we're doing already is in line with HB 2001 and trying to provide for diverse housing types to begin with. I'm not sure that I have any specific concerns that we're not going to have robust public discussion about parking, all those typical things that we see. And I've got no idea for a project name. That's what we pay you for. So good luck.
Yeah, I haven't been earning my keep on that one yet. So Miranda shot down a couple ideas I've had, rightfully so. Anyone else with brilliant ideas on that?
How does House Bill 2003 fit into this?
House Bill 2003 is really not about code standards. So, I mean, we are going to be having having to do the housing needs analysis at a certain time, and the state's ramping up the enforcement of housing needs analysis, and we'll also be needing to follow that up with a housing production strategy, which is probably has some similarities to what we're working on now. And we're staying engaged in that rulemaking. Miranda's on the technical advisory committee for the housing production strategies. And so, yeah, I mean, but other than that, there's no work program items where we need to do the level of changes or efforts as are required by House Bill 2001.
I was thinking more about the target numbers. If we do our best, the merits of that should get us to the target numbers, I would hope, if the target numbers are fairly distributed, right? For affordable housing.
Oh, actual target numbers for affordable housing.
Isn't that the outcome eventually of 2003?
The interesting thing is it's not even specific to affordable housing in terms of the housing production strategy. When the state was looking at when cities most recently adopted their housing needs analyses, there were a number of cities who had not had a recent housing needs analysis. So I think part of the objective of House Bill 2003 was to essentially try to reinstate that regularity and ensure that every city is actually taking stock of their housing demand and supply and how that may or may not match up. And that is related to housing diversity and should hopefully be looking at affordability. It did put in new requirements of looking at price points and market. But that's really in terms of that part, I understand will really feed into the housing production strategy. And that is not very well defined yet in terms of what needs to go into a housing production strategy. And that's the purpose of the technical advisory committee that's serving the rulemaking committee that I'm participating in. So there's a lot more to come on that, and it's not as clear really as House Bill 2001, except that we do know sort of when we would be expected to do our next housing needs analysis. And from what we're looking at right now, it in some ways fits well, because in our last housing needs analysis, we were really looking at expansion into Frog Pond and redevelopment of Town Center as identifying those as areas of need. And so as you saw with Dan's presentation, there's kind of this nexus between the equitable housing and feeding into this work, and this work will feed into then our master planning for Frog Pond East and South and the development there. And then the next step for us would be looking at the housing needs analysis and kind of looking at, okay, now that we've sort of worked on the planning for Frog Pond East and the Frog Pond area, as well as the town center, what are the housing needs? What targets have we set? But doing a whole new analysis in terms of our demand, supply, market shifts, demographic shifts, and where we're trending in terms of our next kind of set of needs for housing production and supply. And so that's where then we would evolve into a housing production strategy after we adopt that housing needs analysis.
The question I have is about town center in terms of fitting into needing to comply with any of this component. Is it because it's a different, I don't know, it's under a different code kind of structure? We have, you know, we developed the town center master plan, but it is developed. So I'm just kind of curious where it falls in this middle housing piece.
So it probably would not be affected because the area already calls for multifamily. It's not an area zoned for single family residential.
Okay, so because it already included, I mean, basically said that's what we want here, we don't even want single
Correct.
family. So, okay.
But it does affect existing neighborhoods in the town center area and in the, you know, I mean, I suppose some of these older neighborhoods, Courtside, for example, are, you know, the houses are getting older, and you may see some of those redevelop. And, you know, other areas of Wilsonville, a little bit similar. Old Town, with the Old Town master plan is another one that you'll need to include in your umbrella.
Yes.
You know, big time. And that we've already talked about that a lot with the updates to the Old Town.
Luckily, we already have duplex design standards in
Yeah.
the Old Town.
Yeah.
So we do have duplex design standards, and that those will have to be looked at in terms of how they fit in with this.
Yeah, specific in for Old Town and the different styles. And there was, if you may recall, if you were here for that, that there was a lot of conversation that the neighborhood didn't really want duplexes, but we saw the writing on the wall for this sort of requirement at that point and really encouraged them. It's like, likely you're going to be required to have them, so you're going to want to include it in your design standards at this point.
So there's your catchy title, Housing Production Strategies. It's got this neat acronym, HPS.
Okay.
Very picky little thing on page 51 of 63, or page 3, whichever you're looking at. You probably already caught it that there's 3-line duplication.
Oh, yeah.
Below multiple unit property tax exemption, the first paragraph there, the last 3 lines are replicated in the next paragraph.
Are you looking at the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan
Yes, the prior.
documents?
That's the prior.
Not the middle housing?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm way back.
Yeah.
Housing.
Like, I don't remember writing that.
Oh, and
You should have, Dan.
it isn't here. Okay, so I should have brought it up when we were talking to her.
But we can note it.
You mean you didn't write this?
Any other ideas or thoughts for Dan? Any other questions, Dan? Other
Yeah,
than
I have
your,
a
what,
question.
any great ideas for a project name?
I have a question, though.
Go ahead.
So, Dan, what are the next immediate steps?
So finish the grant applications. I'm working a lot on grant applications this month into the next month, have some deadlines coming up. So that's the most immediate. And then from there, once we have that funding kind of solidified, the first step this spring would then be to get a consultant on board to do the code audit and audit all these documents.
Great.
Then everybody should be reminded of our event on
Wednesday.
Friday. Is that right?
No.
Wednesday.
On Wednesday. Oh, next,
Open house
yes, the open house. That's
For
next
the-
Wednesday.
for the bridge?
Yes.
Another note I would make for Commissioner Woods is that the other immediate item we have is we are going through the budget process currently. And so this just will be a part of the discussion for that, over that larger discussion on the budget.
Dan, have you identified any key stakeholder groups that you're thinking of?
So I would imagine that all those, because if we identify there's drastic changes to like the Frog Pond Area Plan and the Frog Pond West Master Plan, certainly those people that were engaged there. And, you know, and looking at those, and let me step back and stop saying and. Then I say, I'm doing well here.
It's been a long day.
The grant and Metro's requirements for the grant and additional funding opportunities are really tied to that outreach to communities that have been historically marginalized. So certainly looking at that, and that, in addition to the equity lens, that's certainly a group that we want to make sure we're included here, and seeing how what the outreach that's happened with equitable housing relates to what then is the next step that we do with this project.
Okay.
Was that good? Good.
Yeah, I'm trying to get us to at least answer one of his questions. And so if we can come up with key stakeholder groups, that would be super. You know, from my perspective, trying to think about that, you know, it would seem to make sense that we make sure that we've got a diverse group of stakeholders, maybe homeowners, renters, to get inputs from all of them and make sure that it is not a vocal minority that is driving the responses, because that can happen from time to time, especially on contentious issues like parking. So I think making sure that we can find a way to engage all of those different types and make sure that we're hearing from everybody would be beneficial to me.
Thank you.
Are we good? Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Your packet included the city council action minutes. Does anybody have any questions from staff on those? And then the PC work program. Coming up hearings that were mentioned, and after that, it's mostly usually fluid, right? Things change. But we have it for now pinned on the calendar.
So next month we have a hearing.
Yes, we do.
We do. That's what it says.
We think we're going to be ready for that.
That's the plan.
Good?
And I'll note on that, I have sent out outreach again to that group as mentioned and have not gotten a great response still.
That's good.
Not a lot of interest, so.
We don't want trouble for you. So with that, I think we are at adjournment.
Dang it.
Anybody wants to move that? Bang it. At 8:34. Thank you all.
So moved.